U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has finished 4 days of talks with China's economy policy chiefs. She says while both sides have taken major steps to stabilise the world's most important bilateral relationship, there have been difficult conversations on the use of economic tools to enforce national security. Ms. Yellen has stressed that Washington does not want any surprises from Beijing.
We would welcome transparency from the PRC on its national security actions and greater clarity on where it sees the line between national security and economic issues. This would provide greater stability to the relationship while also helping foster confidence for firms doing business with the PRC, which is in China's interest.
Ms. Yellen also threatened significant sanctions on any Chinese firm that supports Russia's invasion of Ukraine through financial support or military exports. And for more on Janet Yellen's visit to China, we're joined by our correspondents Nick Harper and Olivia Siong. First, let's bring in Nick, who is standing by in Washington, D.C. Nick, the overarching goal of Secretary Yellen's trip was to convey Washington's concerns about China's industrial overcapacity. Now, she was able to make that point reportedly on several occasions, but was she able to find common ground on that with the Chinese officials?
Well, on the surface, this seems to have been a good trip for Janet Yellen. She categorised the meetings as being productive, direct and extensive. She said that the US-China relationship is now on a stronger footing than it was this time a year ago. The Treasury Department here in the US is saying that the Chinese were gracious hosts, that there were no angry responses from what Janet Yellen had to say to them. And we're told that she said it, as you said, over several meetings and very directly. Even, we're told, Beijing acknowledged that there was too much capacity. Perhaps the US going into this with more leverage, the fact that other countries agree with the US, the fact that the Chinese economy back home is weak at the moment and it's trying to push these products out around the world. And we're told that there is now this agreement between the two countries to now hold two working groups in Washington next week with US and Chinese officials looking at the situation. But that's the surface. I think it's important to note that really there were no breakthroughs on this issue. There were no concrete agreements or steps taken by either side. Janet Yellen even acknowledged that though the trip had helped to stabilise relations, there were still many difficulties to overcome. She said that there were complexities in the relationship. And let's not forget that we are in an election year here in the United States, heading towards that November 5th presidential election. And there is a fear here in the US that as we progress towards that, we could see more anti-China rhetoric, more anti-China sentiment, more moves from the US President Joe Biden trying to show that he's protecting US jobs, protecting national economy and the security situation here. So we could see more pushback, all of which could create rockier relationships. So certainly on the surface, a good trip for Janet Yellen, but those underlying issues very much remaining between the two countries.
I'll be looking at those underlying issues in just a short moment. Nick Harper there in Washington, D.C.
From Nick to Olivia, Siong in Beijing for China's reception to Ms. Yellen's trip. Ali, any indication at all that China would cooperate in some way, shape or form with the U.S. on concerns of excess production and national security?
Well, there are similar signals to what Nick was mentioning there from the Chinese side as well. Talks, engagements set to continue with the working groups holding their next meetings in mid-April. According to state media, China's finance minister Liao Min said both sides will continue to strive to create a good environment for trade and investment and promote the healthy and stable development of economic relations. Although there may be no easy solutions to the differences between these two big countries. Secretary Yellen said that the U.S. would not accept Chinese industrial overcapacity again. And in the statement, the Chinese finance minister said that Beijing has fully responded. But what we do know is that this premise of overcapacity is disputed by the Chinese side, while it has previously also pledged to address some of this. It also feels that the U.S. is trying to contain China's development in these high-tech sectors. China again today emphasizing that the concept of national security should not be generalized. And Chinese reports on Secretary Yellen's trip have focused on her comments, mentioning that the U.S. is not seeking to decouple with China. China's finance minister saying that he welcomes this and hopes that the U.S. will take concrete actions, but it hopes to see the U.S. stop sanctions and restrictions on Chinese companies. And this is something that China would be keen on given the state and weak post-pandemic recovery of its economy. But we also know that China is not going to back down on what it sees as these restrictions. We saw its Commerce Minister, Wang Wentao, who is in Paris, tell the EU officials that accusations of overcapacity by the US and Europe are unfounded.
And I suppose to complicate matters, Russia's foreign minister arrives in Beijing as the war with Ukraine drags on. What are both sides expecting from this trip? And how is Beijing planning to balance fragile ties with Washington and ties with Moscow?
Well, already we've heard China's foreign ministry today at its daily briefing hit back at Secretary Yellen's comments, saying that countries should not attack or smear what it says are normal relations between China and Russia, nor should countries harm the interests of China and Chinese enterprises, adding that Beijing will take resolute measures to safeguard its rights. And this comes as we have seen China and Russia draw closer together as both face challenges with the U.S. and the West, even as Beijing says it adopts a neutral position on the Ukraine war. We have seen it come under international pressure to do more to use its influence to rein in Moscow. And we saw the U.S. Treasury Secretary warn that companies, including those in China, must not provide material support for Russia's war and will face significant consequences if they do so. More specifically, also saying that any banks that facilitate significant transactions to channel military or dual-use goods to Russia's defense industrial bases open themselves up to the risk of U.S. sanctions. But this is something that China continues to deny. Have a listen.
关于中俄之间的金融合作呢，建议向中方的主管部门了解。作为原则，中俄之间正常的各领域合作不应受到干扰和限制。
Well, the timing of Secretary Yellen's comments are surely not lost on the Chinese as the Russian foreign minister arrives today for a two-day visit to China. And this comes at the invitation of China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, as China and Russia mark 75 years of diplomatic ties this year. We're told by the foreign ministry that both sides will talk about cooperation in various fields, as well as on international and regional issues. Surely these meetings will be closely watched, not just by the U.S., but the rest of the world as well.
Olivia Siong unpacking Beijing's response. Thanks, Ollie.